Hello there, and welcome to this tutorial on creating the probably most used asset in game history ever, rocks and stones. In the first part of this tutorial, I'll show you some basic techniques on sculpting rocks from primitives, and in the second part, I'll show you how to bake out this sculpt, this high poly sculpt, to a low poly model, and use the baked textures to create your diffuse texture. So at the end of this tutorial, we'll hopefully have game ready low poly rocks. So for this tutorial, we are going to need Blender, GIMP, xNormal, and MeshLab. All of those are free, and we will only use a few functions of MeshLab and xNormal, so you don't need to worry about learning how to use all the features of this software. Alright, so let's take a look at setting up our primitives, such as a cube or a sphere, to use it in sculpt mode in Blender. Now, as I've already said in my tileable ground texture tutorial, you always want to set up a few things before you start sculpting. So you should always set the object to smooth shading, that will speed up sculpting, as well as subdividing it multiple times. Now the difference to the tileable ground floor texture tutorial is that we only use one object to sculpt on, so we increase the subdivisions by a lot, as we can go much higher in poly count for the individual objects, as we only need one single object, other than all those little tiles in the other tutorial. Obviously, how high you go depends on the power of your machine. So if your machine kind of maxes out at a low poly level, you shouldn't go as high on the subdivisions on this stage already. I believe this feature is just important for NVIDIA users. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you should deactivate double-sided, so that not all the polys will be rendered from two sides. That would double the poly count. Another thing you might want to do to increase the speed of the sculpt is to go to the options of the sculpt mode and select fast navigate. This way, every time you move the camera, the poly count will be reduced dynamically, and you can actually move the camera around faster. Lastly, you want to go to the System tab of the user preferences and activate VBO. VBO is vertex buffer objects, and that will kind of join the whole mesh and then render it from buffers, so it speeds up the viewport performance by a significant amount as well. Another thing you might want to do is create a matcap material. You can Google for free matcaps and we'll find some links on full libraries of matcaps. And what this will do is ease up sculpting, as you will see shadows clearer, and it's easier to sculpt on those matcap materials than on the default lighting setup. So for that, just create a new material on your primitive, add the matcap as a diffuse texture, set the shading mode to shadeless, so we don't have any kind of influence by outer light sources, and set the coordinates of the texture to normal. Now you will have applied the matcap material to your primitive, and as I've said, it's easier to sculpt on those. Another obviously optional thing you might want to do is selecting only render in the display tab, so that you only see your sculpt and don't have the grid floor, and you can actually change the background color to kind of give some contrast to your sculpt, so you actually see some of the geometry such as small bumps, etc. better. For this tutorial, we are going to use dynamic topology on the sculpt mode, which will allow us to go much more into detail without actually raising the poly count on the whole object that much. Now, dynamic topology works with constant detail or relative detail. It's on you to decide what you like most. I'll use constant detail, so I can kind of change the brush detail whenever I like. So you start with larger details and sculpt in the basic forms and scrape off edges, etc. And as soon as you're done with the basic sculpt, you can then go down in detail size and actually sculpt in some of the little texture and so on and so forth. Similar to modeling, you want to start with the bigger shapes and then go down to the smaller shapes. Also, make sure to select smooth shading, as this will increase our viewport performance. So before we now start sculpting, I'd like to show you some sculpt settings, some brush setups that will be very useful for sculpting our stones or rocks. The first thing is the trim brush. We create that by using the scrape and peak brush, selecting lock area plane, trim, front faces only, and then selecting a rather harsh curve. You can go as high as the full hardness, but in order to kind of not get too many artifacts, I will only use a very high curve. This will increase our hardness on our brush. And then you can actually just start sculpting and trimming away edges of our primitive. So this way you get kind of the chopped off look of a rock or a stone. Later you can also unlock the area plane, as this way you can kind of dig in holes into the rock or kind of scrape away from the geometry that's not on the surface or on the edges. Lastly, I'd like to show you how to use custom brushes in a way, and we will use an alpha square, which is very common in rock sculpting, as this will let us create harder edges. Now to create a custom brush in a way, we just need to assign a texture to one of the brushes. I will use the clay strips, as this one is very useful for sculpting stones as well. You can just set up a texture, click on New, then go to the Texture tab and select the textures, not the material textures and not the world textures, but this other texture button. And just load your image, your alpha image. Now there's a large variety of alpha images that you can find on the internet, but since I don't want to, again, use anyone's art without permission, I will show you how to create your alpha brush, your square alpha brush on your own. Alright, to create brushes you only need a little image size, such as 256 will do. And alpha brushes will only use color values of black and white, while white is the biggest strength and black is the lowest. And this way you can kind of create any brush you can think of. And we will just create this square brush by kind of just drawing in a square, filling in a square, and leaving a bit of black space around. So we actually have a brush and not just a white plane. So if you keep all those things in mind, you can start sculpting. In this video I've used a sphere as a primitive, subdivided it a few times, and I've just used the methods I've just shown you to kind of sculpt out a rock. Now there's not much I can teach you about sculpting itself, as this is kind of based on creativity and training and doing more and more stuff. I'm not really good at it myself, so I'll just try to comment on the things I'm doing currently in the video and try to give you some helpful advices on how to achieve the rocky, stony look. Alright, so the first thing I do is just scraping away the edges of the sphere. So it doesn't really have edges, but you can just scrape away some of the parts to create some sort of chopped off stone look. Now if you want to create really clean rocks and hand paint them later, you can leave it at that. So this way you can create really clean rocks with sharp cut edges and not much texture detail. I then use the grab tool to kind of move around the geometry a bit to not have such flat edges, but round them up a bit. You can use this to create sort of random shapes if you have no real idea on what you want to sculpt. I mean, it's always better to use reference photos to sculpt, but if you just use free sculpting, you can use the grab tool to get some more curviness and some more random shapes in there. Now since I want to create stony rocky surfaces, I use the clay strips brush and just create some sort of texture on there. Usually I carve out some of the surfaces a bit so it looks like it's washed out stone. Depends obviously on what kind of stone you want to create. I've also decreased the detail size so that I now actually get some more texture detail and not just these big flat areas. I then use the trim brush that I've shown you in the beginning, without the locked area plane, so that I can kind of scrape away some of the texture again, and you kind of build on this chopped off stone look. Sometimes you get really nasty errors with dynamic topology. To sort that out, you can use the smooth brush and kind of get rid of these peaks again. After that, you just need to recreate your texture and re-detail it. Another quick tip to kind of have the same topology on the whole thing is to go to constant detail, change it down to a low amount, the amount you're currently at. So if you already detail it and are at about 5 pixels in relative detail, you go to constant detail and choose detail flood fill. This will now kind of change all the vertices and edges and collapse them or subdivide them so they fit the pixel size. This will obviously highly increase the vertex amount on your model or on your object, but it will also allow you to have some more even distribution of vertices. Alright, so I just repeat all those steps and sometimes change up a few of those and kind of redo it. So use the scrape brush again to scrape off some areas and then retexture it with the clay brush. And yeah, you can this way just create any sort of rock you like. As I've said, it's not really easy to teach you how to sculpt the rock. I won't give you step-by-step solution to create the exact same rock as me, as I only want to show you the tools so you can create your own rocks. Now to create a low poly model that fits to a high poly model, you need to retopologize this high poly model. There are certainly a lot of ways to retopologize in Blender, and there are many tutorials on this. But since I'm a very lazy person, I found probably the most lazy way. Now this way won't work with a lot of models as you have no control over the topology. But for organic stuff like these rocks that are kind of random and it doesn't really matter what topology it has, you can use this method. For that purpose, we are just going to export this high poly rock model with wavefront object, and as always keep in mind to center it at the middle of the origin of the 3D world, of the 3D view, so that the model actually gets exported right. Now we're going to need MeshLab. The first thing you want to do is import the high poly OBJ file. Now MeshLab has certainly many great features, which I know nothing of, but we will need one feature that allows us to reduce the high poly count of our high poly model to a value that we decide on. So we can actually just say we want 100 tries and it will give us 100 tries. For that, just go to Filters, Remeshing, Simplification and Reconstruction and select Quadric Edge Collapse Decimation. Now you can just type in the target number of faces you want, so in this case I'll just use a poly count of 250 faces, and it will reduce the faces of our high poly model to these 250 faces. Now we just need to export it again to OBJ and name it low poly model, as this was already all we need to retopologize our model. Now the next thing we want to do is bake out the normal map and the ambient occlusion map from the high poly model to the low poly model. In my normal map overview video, I said that we will bake everything out with xNormal. Now yesterday I got a comment by Damaged Organic who told me that you can actually bake with cages in Blender with cycles. So I went and tested it out and it works perfectly. So we'll use cycles and you don't need to actually use xNormal for that. But don't worry, we will use xNormal for another feature later in the tutorial. So the first thing you want to do is import the model that we've created in MeshLab and set the shading to smooth. Then duplicate it, as we will now create a cage for baking this out. Rename that duplicated object to cage so we actually know which is which. Then reset the location of all three objects to the center so that they overlap, and with the cage selected, add a displace modifier. Now the cage needs to enclose both the low poly and the high poly objects, as it kind of sets the limits for the rays that are cast to bake out the normal map. So we use the displace modifier to push out the faces of the mesh, which wouldn't work with just scaling it. And make sure that the cage actually encloses everything of both objects, so nothing looks through, as this would be cut off from the normal map. Then we need to unwrap the low poly model. Now for organic things like this rock, especially with the triangulated topology that we have, it's really not easy to get clean unwraps. I tend to just cut it in half, as the seams we will have then will anyway be overpainted in the end, so I'll show you how to get rid of the seams, so it doesn't really matter how you unwrap that. With this certain method of unwrapping, just cutting this thing into half, you can actually save some texture space when doing like 2 rocks on the same texture. So if you create multiple rocks, just make sure that you can fit 2 rocks on the same texture. So after that, you're ready to bake. The first thing you want to do is go to the UV image editor and create a new image. Now the size of this image will be the size of the actual texture that we bake out, so the normal map and the ambient occlusion map. Then make sure to select cycles as the render engine. Add a new material to the low poly object and select, instead of color, image texture, and select the texture that we've just created. Now reset the location of the low poly object to the center again to overlap with the high poly model. Then select the high poly model, hide it, and select the low poly model with shift right click, so that you have one selected and one active object. Then go to the render tab and scroll down to the bake part. Now there are certainly many things you can bake out, but we will just need the normals and the ambient occlusion, so let's start with the normals. As explained in my overview video on normal maps, we will use the tangent space normal map. Check selected to active, as we have one selected and one active object, and select the cage to be the cage object that we've just created. Then you can just hit bake and wait for the normal map to bake out. Also make sure to save the texture. To bake out the ambient occlusion map, I will create a new image and select ambient occlusion in the baking tab. Now since the ambient occlusion is based on the sample rate of cycles, you will need to increase the sample rate in the samples tab. This will obviously also increase the time that's needed to bake it out, but will give you better results. I selected 100, now that's not very much, you will get obvious noise in your ambient occlusion texture, but since it's just sort of a shadow bake, it's not really that necessary to go much higher. After baking that one out, again make sure to save it. Now the next thing I'd like to show you is something I've learned from a great guy over at Facepunch Studios. We will actually bake out a curvature map, which will help us with texturing our diffuse map, as we can highlight the edges of the model without actually painting on them. Now for that purpose, we need to export the cage of our low poly object as well, as for now we only have the high poly and the low poly object in OBJ format. Then we can move on to xNormal. In xNormal, we can just drag and drop the high poly model to the high definition mesh tab and the low poly model to the low definition mesh tab. Then we right click the low poly model inside xNormal and click on Browse External Cage File and select our cage. Then go to Baking Options and scroll down to Curvature Map. Make sure you deselect everything else. Now for the settings for the curvature map, I found a tutorial a long time ago on polycount, I believe. And since I couldn't find it again, I'll just show you the values here. All you need to do is increase the ray amount, as this will increase the quality of the texture, and change the tone mapping to 2 colors, as we only need the red and the green channel. Then you can just bake out the texture. Just keep in mind that baking out curvature map takes usually a lot of time. But once it's done, it's the holy grail of texturing. Now the green and the red channel of the curvature map represent the concave and convex geometry on our model. So we can use this map to create some sort of edge highlight, some edge wear, anything that you can think of that should sit at the edges of the model. So now that we've baked out all the textures, I just went to CG Textures again and chose a rock texture. Make sure to only select smooth rock textures, as we don't want any shadows or geometry in our texture, as the shadows and geometry will come from the normal map, and if they don't fit to the texture itself, to the shadows that are already in the texture, it will look weird. Now in GIMP, I've just quickly overlaid the AO map with multiply onto the diffuse map to kind of mix the shadow in with the diffuse texture. And then I've imported the curvature map, and as we only need the green channel, as we only want edge highlights, we can delete out the red channel. We do this by overlaying a full red color, which means 255 on red RGB and G and B 0. And set the level to subtract on a new layer, and then we can just merge it down so it only applies to the layer that's under it, and we will stick with the green layer. Then we can desaturate that green layer and set it to addition, and now you can increase the lighting amount to increase the highlights you want. In later tutorials we will probably come across this curvature map again and use it in different ways as well. When now creating a spec map from a diffuse map, make sure to hide the curvature map and the ambient occlusion, as the curvature map shouldn't be baked into the spec map, as the edges will then shine too bright. Alright, so we are nearly done now. As you can see, it looks really good already, but we have very visible seams, as the texture, the diffuse texture we used, had different brightness scales from the top to the bottom. So it's actually darker at the seam, and we can see the seam pretty obviously. To fix that, we can just use Blender's internal texture painting. Just go to the UV image editor and select our diffuse texture when in edit mode of the low poly object. Then go to texture paint. Obviously you should be in GLSL mode and have some lighting set up so you actually see your texture. Select the clone brush, hit Ctrl and left click to select the area you want to paint from, and then just paint over the seams. And then after you're done, don't forget to save out the texture. Alright, so this was a basic tutorial on how to sculpt rocks and which tools for sculpting you can use, and how to set up your sculpt mode so that it's actually rendering faster, and texturing the rock using several textures that we baked out from the geometry. Now I hope you can expand on this tutorial and create your own rocks and create bigger rocks, more varying rocks, and use other textures, maybe hand paint them yourself even, and hopefully we will expand on this tutorial in the future and reuse stuff we've learned here in other tutorials. Again, I want to emphasize that this was not meant so that you follow me doing exactly the same rock, but learning the techniques that are necessary to create a rock, to sculpt a rock, and then bake it out, and use the baked out textures to create your diffuse texture and your spec map, etc. Alright, so if you have any questions, suggestions, if anything is unclear, I'll try to solve that and maybe create a second part where I answer the questions. And thanks for watching.